Hey there, YouTubers. Welcome to another video. Today's topic is emergency communications, and let me start off by saying that this is an area that I'm not going to pretend to be terribly knowledgeable on. I've got some thoughts on it, but mostly what I'd like to do is kind of facilitate a conversation. What are we doing collectively as preppers towards emergency communications? Now, there's a lot of different areas to go in. I'm going to talk about just a couple of them and kind of touch on a few others. There's a lot of options out there for us. There's a lot of different things we can do. This might be the time where we need to start talking about a little bit of uniformity, a little bit of agreement among preppers. And if you watch any of these videos, either mine or nearly any other prepper video on YouTube, you see there's not a lot of agreement on things. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of room for people to do their own things. But in this particular instance, it's probably a point where we need to kind of get together and decide what we're doing. Specifically, what I'm talking about is amateur radio. I think the prepper community has really latched on to amateur radio and said that this is great. Now, primarily because it doesn't need anybody else. If your radio is charged and you've got power, you don't have to rely on the internet. You don't have to rely on Ma Bell. You don't have to rely on the cell phone system. You don't have to rely on anything else. It simply works on its own. And if the person that you're trying to reach is in your geographic area, has a charged radio and it's turned on, you're going to be able to communicate with them. That's the beauty of the system. Now, in many cases, there are repeaters. There is a third party that you can work through to get even longer distances and communicate with more people. That's great until you do end up on a real rainy day, and then many of your repeaters are going to be gone. Many of your repeaters don't have backup generation. Those that do, for the most part, are either owned by a public agency or have some involvement with a public agency, so chances are those are going to be full when or being in use when you do have an emergency situation. There are national calling frequencies for what I'll call the UHF, VHF, which are your 2-meter frequencies, which are probably the one to stay with, and then the 70 centimeter if you're a little more urban. There are national calling frequencies on those, and maybe the prepper community needs to say, we are adopting the national simplex frequency, or pick another frequency. If you and your prepper group has another frequency or are all amateur radio techs or other licenses, maybe you need to decide this is going to be our frequency, and then share it. Share it with your local police or put it on your website or make it available on some level or another so that you can talk to the public safety professionals in the event of an emergency. It's probably a good thing to go with. I'm a big fan of amateur radio. I have a technician license personally. Not that I don't appreciate the high-frequency bands, but it's probably not something I'm really recommending for preppers, simply because I'd rather talk to somebody across town rather than somebody across the country. Chances are I'll be talking to or listening to other hams that are high-frequency users that they'll relay information on what's going on around the country, but my focus is really on what's happening very local to me for the safety of me and my family. Then if I am either bugging out or bugging in, keeping kind of localized news and localized information. So I'm not a big proponent of the high-frequency stuff, at least in a prepping situation. If you're just into it, that's cool. It doesn't have to be expensive. I'll just segue into that real briefly. This is an Alinco radio, dual frequency. It does a ton of stuff. I have a few options for it. I changed the antenna and put a mic on it. It's just a 5-watt radio. It costs about $300. It's a very good radio, but it's a fairly expensive radio. This is a dual band radio. This is $60. Now, I could put accessories like that on here. I just haven't done so yet. It doesn't have to be expensive. The test isn't hard. It just takes a little bit of studying. So don't be afraid of that. You can get a radio for as cheap as $60. This is the cheapest one out there right now. It's getting a ton of buzz. It's a lot of value for $60, but it is just a $60 radio. The next kind of plateau level is around $100, where there are some really excellent radios. And then, then 150, 200, 250. Above that, you start getting into different options. For example, this is also a wideband receiver. It's a scanner. Police scanner on top of being an amateur radio. So I can listen to what the police are saying and talk to other people in the amateur community at the same time. That sounds good in practice. Honestly, it's not really. It's not very meaningful. I thought it was very cool and spent extra money to get that. I have not found that to be useful at all beyond some theoretical level. Another thing I'm a big fan of, even though these get a lot of trash talk, are the GMRS, FRS Family Radio Service radios. These are the Midlands and the Unidens, and these are Motorola Talkabouts that I've got right here. These are relatively inexpensive. In fact, they're cheap enough that you can give one to every member of the family. They have tons of privacy codes in them, so even though don't think that people can't hear you, they can. They just won't interrupt when you're talking to your family. This is a great way to go. They're cheap. They're great between vehicles. Now they have some drawbacks. They're limited to 1 to 2 watts of power, depending on the radio that you've got. So don't underestimate these. These are really worth having. These are really worth using. You and your hunting buddies may already have some, but get one for every member of the family. I've already touched upon it a little bit, scanners. Before I was an amateur radio guy, I loved scanners. I've always loved police scanners. These are a great way to go. And as far as emergency communications goes, to be honest, this is probably your best friend. Primarily because you can hear what the police are saying, you can hear what the other emergency responders are saying, and this can be under any scenario. It doesn't have to be the zombie apocalypse. In a tornado, you can listen to the emergency responders, and they are literally the ones that are saying, I see a tornado, it is on the ground at 1st and Locust Street. That is worth its weight in gold. As long as you know where 1st and Locust is in comparison to your house, you now know if you really have to take cover if you don't. Because when they blow the sirens, they're blowing them for a huge area, and when they come on TV, again, they're covering a huge area, and often they're too late. So if you get a scanner, if you do one thing, have a police scanner. You can spend a lot of money, but you don't have to. The one thing to be aware of is there's something out there called APCO 25 or P25 or Project 25. And what that is it's a digital conversion that's slowly happening across the country. And now most departments that have done it are running 2 systems parallel. They're running a digital and an analog. Eventually, the analog side is going to go away. It's only going to be digital. There are scanners for those systems, but they're very expensive right now. Hopefully, those prices come down, but frankly, right now, they're sitting in the $400 to $500 range, whereas you can get one of these from the $200 range, or frankly, around $100 that works great. So keep that in mind. It's not something, if I had to replace this one today, I wouldn't buy an APCO 25, and I live in an area that is slowly converting. But it is out there, and you really do need to be aware of it. This radio will do shortwave. Will pick up shortwave. That's kind of another way of saying HF, but it's a receiver. I'm not really interested in that. If you want to do some listening worldwide, you will be able to get information. It might be worth having under a really dark scenario. But for the most part, for most emergency communications, it's not really necessary. The one thing I do want to touch on, just briefly, because it seems like this has been around for a while, is weather radio. Everybody has a weather radio, or most people do. So they have some knowledge of weather radio and how weather radio works. There's something out there called SAME, Specific Area Messaging or Message Encoding. And what that does is it will turn on the radio automatically when subaudible tones for your area are encoded into the message. So basically, it turns the radio on if there's a message that you need to hear. This has been around for more than a decade now, but a lot of people aren't really aware of it. You really should be. It's a great service. It's a great thing to have. Now, during the day, it's really not much of an issue for me because you can look outside, you can see what the weather's doing, you can kind of tell if things are nasty. What I really use it for is when I'm asleep. It'll turn on, you automatically hear it. I have it kind of loud, so there's no sleeping through it. And you don't get too many false alarms. You get some, and you kind of have to take the good with the bad. But that's out there, and that's really a good way to go. So what I'll kind of end on is I'll jump back to amateur radio here for a minute. Preppers really need to embrace amateur radio, and I think they are for the most part. But I think a little uniformity is really needed on this in a group that really isn't uniform. And pick out some frequencies that are used nationwide for preppers, that are used nationwide for emergency communications, and really try to broadcast those, no pun intended. Really let people know that in a really bad scenario, when everything is down, when we're not going to be able to get on repeaters, go to this frequency and you'll at least be able to hear what's going on. If not, call for support if you need it. So thank you very much. Again, this one's a little kind of all over the place. Well, one thing I'll talk about right here, there are lots of accessories you can get. This is kind of a tactical headset. In hindsight, that was kind of a stupid purchase. What I do like a little bit more, and this was very modestly priced, was just a headset so that I don't have to have it screaming out at me when it's hooked on my belt. This will put it right in my ear and nobody else has to hear what's going on. But please, leave comments, leave your thoughts on this. This is something that I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on, and I really just want to start the conversation and see where this goes. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the video, and please leave comments.